I want to start off by talking a little bit about how long we've been talking about this issue of the greenhouse effect and emissions reduction. So let's look at the technology today, which has obviously given me plenty of headaches in trying to get set up with like 2 laptops and a mobile phone over there and a speakerphone. That's come a hell of a long way since this magazine cover was published in 1988. If I think back to what I was doing in 1988, I would have been 6 years old. And that was the first time that I was ever introduced. Hello, come on in. That was the first time that I was introduced to a computer. So I remember being in primary school in year 1, and the teacher was trying to show us how to use this BBC Micro computer. So she was trying to use the mouse to get up to the menu to do something or other, to open some app. And she could not do it. She just couldn't get her head around how a mouse works. I think even at that time, probably the 6-year-old students could have given her a hand and told her how to do it. I'm sure her ability to use that technology has come a long way, and our own understanding of technology has advanced an enormous amount over the last 30 years. So it just shows how long ago that was in terms of how the world has moved on and where we've got to. If I think about the things that I've done between then and now, I graduated from school, I went on my gap year, flew around the world, had a great time going skiing for 5 months, bought my first car, sold my first car, came away to Australia for the first time, went back to the UK, bought a house, came back out here again when I realized the error of my way, built a house. And through that whole process, my personal carbon footprint was growing, and the carbon footprint of us as a society was growing as well. And I didn't really think that much about that, to be honest. So to me, climate change was kind of this background noise, going back to when I'd first heard about it when I was about the same age as when I was trying to learn how to use a computer when I was 6. And it was an important issue, but it wasn't really anything to do with me. So it wasn't something which was affecting how I was going to live my life. And it wasn't something that I paid a lot of attention to. But fortunately, there were other people in the world who were thinking much more about this kind of stuff. And they've made me making a lot more noise about it, particularly over the last decade. And I'm sure these are voices that one way or another, we've all begun to sit up and listen to, which is probably why we're all coming together and meeting today. The thing which really turned me onto this in a way that I hadn't been previously was when I started to hear about the kind of tipping points which were potentially possible. So, for example, if the Arctic tundra melts and all the methane trapped in that is released to the atmosphere, methane is, as you probably know, a very, very potent greenhouse gas. So that could lead to an outcome which is an order of magnitude worse than what we're currently predicting to happen with current emissions profiles. And there's a very, on the balance of probabilities, that probably won't happen. That's an extreme outcome. But it is still something which could happen. And it didn't seem to make any sense to me, just statistically, why we would roll the dice like that with this one planet that we've got to live on. So that made me pay attention. And it seemed like a particularly crazy thing to do, because we don't actually have to take that risk, because the technologies which can get us out of this problem have come along in the last 30 years considerably as well. So if you look at the statistics, which many of you probably know, about the cost of solar, wind, and batteries, these have fallen dramatically in the last 30 years, and particularly in the last 10. So it's really been an exponential fall. And it's got to the point now where if you have the right renewable resources available, so the right sun and the right wind, then you can actually build a renewable energy plant, which is cheaper to build and operate than an equivalent coal-fired power station, depending on where you are. So that's an incredible tipping point in its own right, and something which should get us really excited as we look forwards to the future. If we think more locally to those of us who are based in Australia and think about the renewable resources which are available to us here, well, we're in a pretty good place. This graph is an indication of the solar potential of different countries around the world. So the grey dots are different countries, and the red dot is Australia. So basically, top right is better. And you can see we're pretty much right up there in the Premier League in terms of the amount of solar power which we can generate. And I think looking at this metric, it's actually just purely on a per meter square basis as well. So multiply that up by the amount of land area we have, and you can't really think of anywhere better. And of course, we have incredible wind, certainly all along the west coast, which I know pretty well from being a tented windsurfer. Other areas of technology are exciting as well. So if we look at aviation and we look at the big companies, Boeing and Airbus, but Airbus particularly, they're throwing out some really, really exciting concepts. So these are their plans for hydrogen-fueled aircraft, which they plan to have in service by 2035, and which will emit nothing except water to the atmosphere. That would be incredible if we can get on a plane and not create any emissions. So there's a lot of good news out there. And if I think ahead to when my children are about the age that I am now, which takes us just beyond the 2050 targets around net zero, which many companies and countries are putting in place, there's a lot of potential that they could be really have something to smile about. Something great could happen in terms of our transition. So that might be the case, but we've got an awful long way to go. So these are the statistics for CO2 emissions since 1850. And it's basically a rising exponential curve. And greenhouse gases take an awful long time to be removed from the atmosphere. So every year, year on year, we're increasing substantially the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it's not just emissions from one sources which are the problem. We've got emissions across a whole range of different categories to deal with. So it's energy, electrical energy, but it's also transport, it's buildings, it's manufacture, it's agriculture. So there's no one nut that we can crack here to solve this problem. And if we look at the situation in Australia, it's a pretty similar curve. We're actually doing less well than many other Western nations who have been on a modest but steady decline over the last decade. Apart from COVID, it's not even really clear if in Australia our emissions have actually peaked yet at all. We can find some solace if we look to what we've achieved in terms of the renewable energy sector. So this is statistics on renewable electricity generation in 2020. So this was from the Clean Energy Council's latest report. And that quotes a figure of 62 terawatt hours of renewable energy, which was generated in the last year. So 62 terawatt hours is a big number. A terawatt hour is like the kilowatt hours which you have on your electricity bill, except it's just much bigger. For comparative purposes, so you can put that in some context, total national electricity generation was 227 terawatt hours. So renewables were about 28% of total generation, which is a good number and a big number, but it still means that over 70% of the grid is not based on renewables right now. We can look ahead to what projects are in the pipeline. So this is from the same report, and it's looking at the projects which are either under construction or which are financed. So if we add all of those up together and convert them to a terawatt hour basis, we're looking at about another 35 terawatt hours per year of generation. So that's about a 50% increase on current renewable capacity, which is pretty good, but it still only gets us to under 50% of the grid being renewables based. Now, there are some mega projects in the pipeline, which would actually dwarf that in terms of the amount of renewable energy which is generated. This was the proposal for the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, a wind and solar farm up in the Pilbara, which on completion, so it's a staged project, but on completion, they'd be hitting 100 terawatt hours of generation. So that's over 100% more than we're currently generating from renewables. Absolutely massive mega project. But unfortunately, that has hit a roadblock. It got through state approvals for the first phase and then was really shot down by the federal environmental minister. So that was shut down on the basis of local environmental concerns to do with the wetlands. So this was actually a project which was not just about electricity generation, but hydrogen and ammonia for export. And that meant that they needed to access the sea, and that meant disruption to these wetlands. So that project really can't proceed in its current form. And it highlights the tension that you see here between local and global environmental concerns. There'll be many other issues as well which crop up with these mega projects, because you're looking at an enormous change to the landscape and the life of the people who live in that landscape. Two things close to my heart. One of them that most people will recognise if they drive to and from Henderson, the Coburn Cement Works. And the other one is the direct flight from London Heathrow to Perth. So taken together, these two things, which don't appear in a picture like this normally, they represent two of the hardest to abate forms of emissions, so the hardest emissions to deal with. Cement manufacture is a really, really tough one, because to make cement, you've got to take limestone, calcium carbonate, and then you need to get the calcium out of that, which basically means that you create as much carbon as you create cement. So very roughly, there's this one-to-one relationship. So if you think about the building room right now, and the bridges you drive over, all the buildings in the city, that is an incredible amount of concrete with cement in. I don't do. And all of that is emitting an equivalent amount of CO2 to the atmosphere. And with our current technology, we don't really have a way in which we can generate cement and concrete without creating that problem. And there's an awful lot of development going on, not just in this country, but in developing countries and other countries as well. And also to support renewable projects. So you need concrete foundations for wind farms and so on. Looking at long-haul aviation, that is a really, really big challenge, because to fly a plane from here to Singapore or to Abu Dhabi or all the way to London, you need liquid fuels. You just can't beat liquid fuels for the energy density in terms of volume and in terms of weight. And right now, the only remotely economical way in which you can produce liquid fuels is by fossil fuels. So that's a big challenge. And if you look at those exciting concept designs by Airbus, which I showed off, they look great. But look again at that slide, because the range is 1,000 to 2,000 nautical miles for those concepts. Hydrogen just doesn't have the energy density. You need to go an order of magnitude further if you're going to do the long haul flights that we've all come to know and love. Certainly I do, because it gets me back to see my family in the UK when it's running. In fact, if you take all those different various forms of emissions and you compare them to the amount of electricity we would have to generate if we found a way to generate all of that energy from renewable sources, you would have to create 1,600 terawatts of renewable energy every single year. So compare that to the 62 terawatts, which we're currently generating from renewable sources, and the 227 terawatts of all electricity generation in Australia today. And you get a really good idea of the scale of the challenge before us. So we've got to do a couple of things. We've got to take the technologies which we know work, wind, solar, batteries, and we've got to scale them up. We've got to do that at an unprecedented rate. We also need to deal with how we deal with all these different emission sources, which we don't actually have an answer for how we're going to reduce them down to net zero at the moment. So we've got to innovate, we've got to fund R&D to get this problem sorted. If you think of that scale of challenge which is ahead of us, to me, it really is this all hands on deck moment. This is the your planet needs you moment. You can compare it to a national or an international emergency. Think of something like a war. So think about if you're standing in the streets in 1939 and you hear announced that there is now a war against fascism. You could feel overwhelmed by that national challenge. And I think a lot of the time when we think about this global challenge, we feel overwhelmed. But unless you were a particularly egotistical general, you wouldn't be thinking about how you were going to solve this whole problem yourself and win the war by yourself. Instead, you'd be thinking about where you sign up and how you play your part. And I think that's the question we need to ask ourselves here. We're not going to solve the problem on our own, but how can we make our contribution to solving the problem? Takes us back to where we are in Australia, in this continent which is basked in sunshine, and it becomes pretty clear that the route that we need to take to decarbonisation is finding those ways to electrify absolutely everything. But once we've done that, we will still have more renewable energy than can meet all of our own needs, ultimately. And so that creates an incredible export opportunity, both for WA and for Australia as a whole. And that, I think, is really, really exciting, because we could be on the cusp of a boom here in new renewable energy, which is like, if not bigger than the mining booms which Perth has experienced over the last 50 years. And when I think about that, and I think about all the different things which can come together to create that opportunity for us, I get pretty excited about what could happen in Perth here. And slightly hyperbolically, I would say this is the most exciting place to be in the world right now. Other people in other places might agree, but I think it's a cool place to be, and I think there's a lot of opportunity. There are a number of different things which I think can come together to make us a really strong cluster for the production of renewable energy, but also the growth of the skills in the renewable energy industry, which we can then export elsewhere. We've got the resources, both financial resources, natural resources, which we've already discussed. We've got the institutions which have been built up through the current industries which dominate this state. We've got the people. We've got an incredible number of talented people in this state. And we've got the place. We've got this nice place to be, which we can attract talent to. We're going to touch on more on each of those things in turn. So when we talk about the resources, I have talked a lot about the natural resources available, but financial resources are really important as well. So we are a prosperous state here, and we have done well out of the last 50 years, particularly. So there is a lot of funding out there with the potential for investment in renewable projects. And we're also a good place to do business. So that means that other people's funding will come here as well. So if we look at the example of what happened with the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, which I mentioned earlier, it was only a few weeks after that project hit its major roadblocks that the funding and the backers behind that project were actually turning their attention to somewhere else in the state. And last week, or the week before last, a new project was announced on the southern coast of the state, which is even bigger than the Asian Renewable Energy Hub, and will be an incredible project if it takes off in terms of the export opportunity which it will create for this state. Institutions. So this is all different kinds of institutions. So companies, educational institutions, small and medium-sized enterprises, way too many to mention in one slide. But I think there's three really nice examples just to illustrate the kinds of institutions that we have here, which we can build upon. So starting with large private industry, if we think about Fortescue Future Industries, as a spin-off basically from FMG, which is taking the incredible resources of FMG and the thrust and drive of Andrew Forrest and putting that towards firstly decarbonizing FMG's operations, but then looking about how they can take advantage of this economic opportunity. That's a really exciting development which is happening right under our noses, and I'm really interested to see where it goes. Slightly different example, the Future Batteries Cooperative Research Centre, which is headquartered at Curtin University, but it is an interconnection of different organisations all over Australia. They are tasked with finding ways to develop new forms of battery technology, which they can then take to market. The exciting thing about that is it's a way in which we can move from just digging up the resources out of the ground for batteries and selling them to the rest of the world to manufacture, to actually taking on more of that value chain ourselves, developing the IP around the batteries, possibly even the manufacture here within Western Australia. And the Core Innovation Hub, so this is just down the terrace, a few of you might know it. It's a co-working space where you have corporate innovation teams working together with small startups, really exciting environment in which people can innovate in the energy sector. So just three examples of the kinds of institutions that we have at our disposal and which we can build upon here. The people. So we definitely have the people. They may not all be in the room today, but we have them. There are more engineers per capita in WA than anywhere else within Australia. And actually, that's only half the story, because within WA, we're immensely concentrated. So most of them are probably within about 3 miles of where we're sitting right now. That is an incredible innovation cluster, lots and lots of potential there. In fact, all told, there's about, on this census category alone, there are about 40,000 engineers. but I'm sure there's others scattered through other census categories as well. For me, I don't know about you, but every time I go to a barbecue, it feels like people I bump into are either engineers, FIFO workers, baristas serving coffee, to those two. The place. This is something which surprised me a little bit when I was doing the research for tonight. Place is really important in the formation of innovation clusters. So if you look at somewhere like Vancouver or Silicon Valley, one of the parts of the reason that those areas are so successful is because they're places people want to be. And as someone who has moved from the rainy UK to here, I can see the appeal of that. We have the beaches, we have the landscape. I probably don't have to sell Perth on you. That's really appealing. Talented people will move themselves and their families here, and they'll bring their skills with them. So the question posed at the outset was, we all know decarbonisation matters. What does that mean for us? I think turning that question around a little bit, it's really, what does it mean for this WA new energy cluster? How do we get this thing going to advantage ourselves and what we want to do for the planet? So since we're in Engineers Australia, I'll start with Technology View. This is a report I shared a link to, so a few of you may have seen it a couple of months ago. It's a report by DNVGL about the technologies which they think are the key technologies which we have to get right to successfully move through the energy transition. And I liked it because it took this big complicated problem and it made it into something a little bit easier to understand, at least for me. So the technologies which they selected were selected on two basic criteria. So the first criteria was it had to be something which moves the dial, something which makes a difference. And the other criteria was that these technologies had to be mutually supportive of each other. So a change, it's a 2 + 2 = 5 thing. A change in one would have a knock-on effect in another area. And the technologies covered with 10 different areas, and they covered everything from energy production through to storage through to end use. Now, we in Western Australia won't end up being good at all of these things. So there will come a point where we will need to make decisions collectively about where our strengths are and then reinforce that success. That probably will happen organically. It won't be driven by any one individual or organization. But I think it's important for us to recognize that, because as companies and as individuals, really we want to be putting our effort in where there is this groundswell of action happening from others as well, because then you get the leverage benefit of all doing something together in the same place. So we need to keep an eye on that. We need to think about what those places are going to be. It could be, for instance, around battery technology, based around the future battery CRC and other things going on. It could be building on all these enormous hydrogen and ammonia production projects. Maybe we become world leaders in that. Or it could be something a bit more left field. So it could be something like floating wind. Me and Alex were talking about that, where we've got plenty of skills within WA built up in the offshore oil and gas industry, which are incredibly relevant to floating wind. We may not have the need right now within our state for that, but that could be a capability which we can export and services which we can export. Innovation clusters tend one way or another to come about because of some form of government support. Not all the participants in innovation sectors clusters would necessarily recognize that that's the case. So if you look at the growth of Silicon Valley in the 1970s and 1980s, and you were to ask the key entrepreneurs who were involved in that growth what the key underpinning factor was, they probably would say it was their own drive and entrepreneurial vigor and so on, which is part of the story. But actually the story of Silicon Valley is also the story about a lot of US government money which was pumped into that area after the Second World War and into the Cold War, into the development of new electronics. So Lockheed Martin was for many years the largest employer in the valley. And what that meant is that you had people who moved with their families into that area, and ultimately their children, people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, were the ones who innovated and led to the growth of the industry there. So government has a role. Government can spend money, they can procure. Government can provide other kinds of supports. They can provide sort of low-key consultancy support and so on. But they can also subsidize, or whatever they would like to call it. And subsidizing is important, not so much when you've got things which need to scale out, like the batteries and the wind and the solar, because they're at the point where they can stand on their own feet economically anyway. But it's when you've got those earlier stage technologies, and hydrogen as a marine fuel is a great example right now, where it just economically makes no sense at all to make that transition for an individual actor, a ship operator, for instance. But we need to get to the point where we've got scale of supply and scale of demand in order for the economies of scale to drive down the cost. And really the only way you can unlock that chicken and egg situation a lot of the time, particularly when you're doing it for long-term altruistic reasons, is with the support of government on behalf of society. So they need to help out there. And we each have the ability to influence that. So on the 1st of June, sorry, the 9th of June this year, I did my citizenship ceremony at Mount Hawthorne Hall. And I thought it'd be this kind of like perfunctory exercise where you just get handed a bit of paper and then you leave again. But actually, it was quite a fun evening. We had like a choir, and you get to shake hands with the mayor, and they give you a little pot of Vegemite and everything. And then which I still got. And then at the end of it, you get taken to the side and you get taken to register to vote, which is a big thing for me as well. So I intend to use that vote wisely. And the idea is not that this isn't a political group, we're not getting together to talk about politics, but I think we can each consider the impact that our vote can have, because it makes a real difference to the policies which will create the kind of future that we want to create. And then the third thing with this trio is to build out our network. And I guess that gets the heart of why I wanted to start this net zero group. Let me explain that with a bit of a story. So just before Christmas, so in December time last year, I got invited to an event called the Corporate Innovators Group, which is a pretty informal get-together of various different R&D managers from different corporations within the city. The idea is just to chew fat, share ideas, and so on. Now, it was in December, so December's always busy, and my son's birthday is in December as well. And I basically nearly didn't go to this thing because I'd had a long day, it was 6:30, I was still in the office. But I thought, it sounds interesting, I'll give it a go. So on my way home, I went through the city and I went along, had a beer, and as I was walking to the train station afterwards, I got chatting to an R&D manager for another company, which is particularly interested in the supply of hydrogen as a fuel. We were talking about ships and ferries and marine fuels and so on. Anyway, long story short, what that led to was a collaborative effort between ourselves and that company to develop a new ferry concept powered only on hydrogen, which we then tested with Austal's customers, got their feedback on, and then we're now working on and refining further. So I'm really excited that could lead to somewhere pretty exciting in terms of a joint announcement. And it all came about just through the serendipity of that meeting. So if you multiply that effect up from 1 time to 10 times to 100 times to 1,000 times, and you start to get a really strong sense of what could happen when you get people in different industries who are talking to each other about these problems and about what we want to achieve together in the future. So I'm going to just wrap up, and then I think we'll move on to a bit of a discussion between ourselves about what all this actually means and what we're going to do. By referring to a much older innovation cluster. So this is an image of the Lloyds coffee shop in London. Some of you may know the story of Lloyds. Founded in 1686 by a guy called Edward Lloyd. It was a melting pot of ideas. So you had sailors, merchants, ship owners, all drinking coffee together in one place. It was actually founded by Edward Lloyd, who's an entrepreneurial guy who knew, firstly, I guess he must have known how to make half decent coffee, whatever that was by late 17th century standards. But he also knew how to attract customers. And so the way that he did that is he read out the shipping news. So he had all these people who are interested in shipping coming into one place. And they started to talk to each other about the problems that they had. And it led to some really interesting innovations, which actually have laid much of the foundation of the global network of trade, which we exist in and all benefit from today. So for example, you could have had a merchant talking about how he's shipping his spices to the other side of the world, But if he loses them, he'll be ruined and he'll lose all his money and get chucked out of his home. Perhaps he had a richer merchant there who then said, okay, well, I've got loads of money, just pay me a fee. And if you lose that cargo, don't worry, I'll cover it. That's the foundation of Lloyd's insurance market. The merchant turned insurer then has the challenge of knowing that that cargo is going to be shipped safely to the other side of the world. And the ship that it's going to go in is not going to sink. And that's the foundation of assurance bodies and classification societies like Lloyd's Register. So in fact, all told, if you look up on Wikipedia, all the different organizations which can trace their origins back to Lloyd's Coffee Shop, there's something like 15 different organizations which are still alive today, which have a really key role in the international system of trade, which have the word Lloyd's in the title just because of that association. So when Lloyd's Coffee Shop was going in the late 17th century, ships were sailing around the world powered by sail. And then through the late 19th century and into the 20th century, there was a massive transition to coal and a corresponding transition to oil, diesel, gas today. And whilst the maritime industry was going through that transition, there was a similar transition happening on land. And through each step of that transition, we as a society are getting deeper and deeper and deeper into our addiction to fossil fuels. What we have now in 2021 in Perth and in other places as well is the opportunity to put forward the intervention which is going to break that addiction. Now, I think that's really exciting. And that was what led me to post my original post, which led me to setting up this group, which is all about how will I take advantage of this moment? Like if I'm looking back on this in 30 years' time, I don't want to think that 30 years ago, I could have done something and didn't do something. I want to have an impact. So I want to put myself out there and think about what that impact could be. And I think from talking to various people in the room individually, you feel like that as well. So my proposal with this concept of the net zero network is just something small to get us started, like the Lloyd's Coffee Shop. We just need to get together, start sharing ideas, thinking about what could come of our efforts and see what comes out of it. And for that reason, that's why I'm finishing with a picture of the pub. So make sure we go there afterwards. Thank you.
Well done, mate.